Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning. So we have a little bit of work still left for us to do. I said that we were going to move on from Gaon, but I realized after the share that we had missed out two very important aspects, or two things I still want to mention about Gaon before we go on to the concluding Geonim. So we're still in the life of Gaon, this incredible figure who dominates the last centuries of the Gaonic era and influences halacha and hashkafa in so many ways. I want to mention two more things about him before we move on to the closing of the Gaonic era and the last Gaonim. The first is one point from Rav Gaon's main philosophical book that I forgot to mention. We spoke about his book of Emunah V'Deus, Beliefs and Opinions, as it's often translated. And he says one of my favorite ideas there that I often quote. As far as I can tell, he's the first philosopher ever to mention this and spell this out specifically. I'm not aware of any earlier philosophy who makes this point. And he deals with the famous can God create a stone that he can't lift paradox. So there are a number of paradoxes in believing in an omniscient and omnipotent God, or more importantly in our context, omnipotent God, God who's all-powerful, such as if he's all-powerful, then presumably he can do anything. If he can do anything, he could create a stone that he can't lift. Well, in which case he's not all-powerful, and we end up with this sort of paradoxical reasoning. There's variants of it. Can he cause there to be anything which he can't do? Is the more abstract way of saying it, which is how Gaon expresses it. We could also lead this into monotheism. Could he create another God? Can he create a more powerful God than himself? So there's a whole array of problems around omnipotence. And Rav Gaon's basic answer, which is a very neat piece of reasoning, which is why I like it, is that he can create anything, he can't create nothing. In other words, there has to be a coherence to what we're describing him as creating. It has to carry meaning. If it doesn't carry meaning, if it's a nonsensical term, then there's nothing that he can't do, because this isn't anything. This isn't describing anything. Let me try and just explain what he means in a number of layers. If I say, can a Gaon create a choli? And you say, well, Dayan Zobin, what's a choli? And I say, no idea, but can God create a choli? And they say, well, what's a choli? And I say, no idea, but can he create it? Well, you have to define the term. If you're using a nonsensical set of syllables, that isn't describing anything God can or cannot do. It has to carry some content or some meaning to it. If it carries no content, no meaning, there's no conversation taking place over here. So can God create a choli? Well, these are just syllables. They're not, well, you see, there's a limit to God's power because he can't create a choli. Well, these are just meaningless syllables. They're not carrying any content to them. If I want to say God can do anything, the answer is he can do anything. He can't do something which is nonsensical, where the terms carry no meaning to them. It's just sounds. Now, if I ask, can God create a square circle? Rav Gaon points out, can he create a square triangle? What I'm saying is, each syllable makes sense. Square makes sense. A triangle makes sense. A circle makes sense. But in combination, they carry no meaning, because a square means a four-sided object. A triangle means a three-sided object. Can he create a four-sided, three-sided object? This is an incoherent sequence of syllables that carries no meaning to it. It's the same as asking, can God create a choli? It's a sequence of syllables that doesn't carry any content. In no sense is there any limit to God's ability to do everything, because each syllable is pronounceable, each word by itself makes sense, but in combination it carries no meaning. And therefore, can God create a stone that he can't lift? Is another way of saying, can you create a stone which a being that can lift it? Can you create a stone that isn't liftable by a being that can lift any stones? That sequence of syllables together carries no meaning because it has an inherent internal contradiction in the sequence of words. So God can do anything. He can't do, if I put together a string of nonsensical syllables, I'm not asking anything when I say, can God do it? And that's what I mean when I ask, can God create a stone that he can't lift? It's a sequence of syllables that carries no meaning. Thus says Rav Saadia. Everyone comfortable with this? Yeah. Excellent. Good. Okay. I'm pleased that's resolved. Of course, this generates a lot of thought and a lot of discussion, but it's definitely a beautiful idea to reflect upon. Yes, Amrom.
Yeah. Reality. it's within our limited understanding, one can't square a circle. But if that had the ability to change reality.
Okay, we'll come to that point in a minute, Avram. There is a depth here which is also very profound and beautiful. Yes.
You don't create Yesh Me'ayin.
Yes.
So why can't you create Ayin Yesh?
Yesh Me'ayin is not a logical inconsistency. It's not a concept where the terms don't carry any meaning. As far as we know in science, there's rules of conservation of energy and conservation of matter and the like, and maybe they're the same thing. But there's no logical inconsistency in being able to bring something out of nothing. It's not a sequence of syllables or terms that carries no meaning or no content to it. It's simply something that breaks the laws of nature. God can break the laws of nature, no doubt. However, logical inconsistencies, can you make 1 + 1 = 3? Well, if the definition of 3 is 1 + 1 + 1, it carries an internal. Can you make 2 = 3? It's an internal inconsistency. 2 = 3 is a set of sounds that carries no meaning to it. Now, the greater depth in this, which Avram began sort of heading towards, is that, in a sense, all of this is post the creation of logic and words themselves. Within the realm of human reason, where we can use words have to carry content. In essence, logic is our very ability to reason itself. Now, on some abstract level, we may accept and we may understand that God exists pre-logic in the same way as he exists pre-time and pre-space. The whole point, though, is that in that pre-logical world, we enter a world of silence. We enter a world of non-reason. And there we can't say anything at all. So it's true, and Gaon would acknowledge that God exists pre-logic itself. In a world in which there is no space at all, nothing spatial, there are no triangles, there are no squares. In a world which is a singularity, there may not even be the concept of plurality. There may be nothing more than one. In a world that's wholly simple, which is what we describe to God pre-creation, there may not even exist numbers. And we're going to revisit these ideas, by the way, a little bit later. So it is true that, in essence, pre-creation, not just pre-creation of physical and material world, but pre-anything, a real depth of ayin, of nothingness, there are no words and logic either. But we can't say, well, in that world, could God make 1 and 1 = 3? Because there isn't the word 1, there isn't the word 3. You can't say in that world, can God create a stone that he can't lift? Because there are no stones, there is no lifting. You can't say in that world, can God make a square triangle? Because there are no squares, there are no triangles. There's a breakdown in reason and language itself. So we're left in a safe space. If we are talking about pre-creation, where we know God is all-powerful, we have no words. Here we're edging towards the Rambam. Even when we say God is all-powerful, in post-creation, when we say God is all-powerful, we mean anything that exists, he has power over. In a pre-creation world, when we say he's all-powerful is too weak a description of Hashem, because we're getting to infinity. What we mean is, we get back to the Rambam's negative language, all we can say is what God isn't. He's not limited by anything. But in a post-creation world, once we are interested in logic, once there's a human there who's reasoning and trying to talk about God, in that world, we don't have to worry about these inconsistencies, because in a world in which we're using the language of reason, we don't have to worry about something unreasonable. Unreasonableness carries no content to it. So there is no problem in a stone that God can't lift, because that term carries no meaning to it. In a world pre-creation, there are no stones, there's no space, there's no lifting. In a world pre-creation, there are no triangles and squares. And therefore, we don't have these paradoxes. There aren't even numbers. So not just pre-physical creation, the concepts of creation, when there's true ayin, there is no reason and no logic and no language. We enter a world of silence where we have no tools of reason whatsoever. And the most we can, when we're describing that world, is using non-words. When we say God is above time and space, what we mean is he's not in time and space. When we say God is infinite, we mean he's not finite, as the Rambam points out. Now, Gaon doesn't spell this out like this. It doesn't take negative theology as far as the Rambam does, as we discussed in previous shiurim. But the core idea that Gaon is saying, I think, is a very important one and a very nice piece of beautiful reasoning and logic. There's a beauty to this idea if one enjoys ideas. And Gaon simply points out that a square triangle is a meaningless sequence of sounds. A stone he can't lift has the same meaningless problem. We're not identifying anything God can or can't do. We're not asking a meaningful question. Can God create a chili? It carries no content, that word. And similarly, though we may not notice it, a square triangle carries no content either. Thus says Rav Gaon in his Emunah V'Teis. And it's one more idea that I forgot to mention that I wanted to share from him, and it's going to be an important introduction to his next work, which we need to talk about that I forgot to mention. All okay? Okay. Now, in the times of Rav Gaon, there was a mystical work, or I won't even label it a mystical work. There was a work of philosophy or mysticism floating around, which still exists to this day, known as the Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation. And it's a book that claims to describe, in mystical or philosophical terms, depending how you read it, creation itself. It is referenced earlier as the book that, if one understands, can be used for humans even to create life. Here we get to the sort of Golem ideas and so on. The Gemara references the Gemara in Megillah and elsewhere. Amaraim, who studied the Sefer Yetzirah and knew how to bring life into existence. So it's a book that deals with a very deep matter, and it's studied to this day by Kabbalists and the like. The Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation, or the translation loses a little bit in English because the terminology is critical over here. We have in Hebrew a number of words for creation. For example, bria. Bria is yesh me'ayin. Yetzirah is more connected to the word sor, letzaya, to carve out. Yesh me'ayin, bria, creation, is something from nothing. Yetzirah is once you have something, you form it or shape it into a tzura, into a form, and that's a sort of second stage of creation. So perhaps it's dealing with the second stage of creation, not the first stage of creation. No one but God can bring something into existence from nothing, but human mystics may claim the ability to be able to shape or reshape creation in a miraculous manner into being something else. So this is the Sefer Yetzirah. Now, tradition, it was around in Rav Gaon's time. It was already then evidently a very ancient work, meaning that Rav Gaon didn't think it was written in the last few hundred years. He himself saw it as an ancient work. Tradition ascribes it to Avram Avinu. And we know that Avram engaged in philosophical, perhaps mystical contemplation in arriving at belief in God, and tradition ascribes it to Avram Avinu. Now, Rav Gaon decided to write a perush on it, a commentary on it. We'll see maybe later why he wants to write a commentary on it, but he does. And this commentary is still extant, and it seems that it was popular from his own lifetime, at least into the 1100s and onwards, and then declined in popularity, perhaps as Maimonidean thought superseded his thought in the philosophical world, and as the mystics took over the other part of the world, so it sort of declines in popularity. But it's still around, and it was written in Arabic, in Judeo-Arabic, like his other works. It was translated by Kapach, the same sage, Yemenite sage, who translated the Perishim Mishnayos into Hebrew, and it's translated by others. It's one of the studied works of the medieval era. Now, Rav Gaon writes an introduction, and he says in this introduction, I don't believe that the text of Sefer Yetzirah was around from the time of Avram Avinu. I don't think this is correct. We would have found references to it. It wasn't floating around at the times of the Nevi'im. And more than that, the Oral Torah, the Torah Bavel, wasn't written down. I think it was Mishnaic era in origin. It's a type of Mishnah, if you like, of philosophy and mysticism. So in the same time as in the Mishnaic era, Torah Peh, halachic Torah Peh began getting written down. And we have the Mishnah, but not just the Mishnah. Others were writing things down. We have the Tosefta written by Reb Chia, and we have Brises, external sources in the Gemara. So it was the era in Jewish history when they began writing down oral traditions. So similarly, the Sefer Yetzirah was written down in that time, and Rav Gaon, who was a remarkable thinker, who knew so many things, thinks that there are linguistic and semantic and philological reasons for thinking the language is Mishnaic in style, and therefore he says Sefer Yetzirah is a Mishnah, should be viewed as a Mishnah of sorts, a philosophical or mystical Mishnah. Very, very interesting concept. I don't want to pit Reb Saadia against modern day academics, other than to say that this remains a running debate even in modern day academia, whether it was dated, whether it's Mishnaic era work or not. But this is what Rav Saadia thought, and many academics continue to think that based on the language of the Mishnah, and he got there first, like with so many other ideas. He analysed the language and the style and thought it was Mishnaic. So he says, what do we do with the tradition that it dates back to Avram Avinu? Well, he says it's very hard to know exactly, how to what degree ideas are transmitted onwards. But if it's a Mishnaic work reflecting oral tradition, which reflects Jewish thinking about ideas, and the origin of Jewish philosophy is Avram Avinu, then ideas contained within it, in some sense, are Avram Avinu's ideas, and it was writing those down in sort of philosophical form. In other words, the Nevi'im and even Moshe perhaps didn't need to engage in philosophy. They spoke to God. Avram didn't, at least initially, have that gift, that privilege. He has to discover God himself. So Avram engages in philosophy, and if there was any living philosophical tradition remaining amongst Jews, again, how much do Jews engage in philosophy? We saw not very much, but to the degree that they speculated and thought about these things, this is the oral traditions that went around in the Jewish world, perhaps dating back to Avram Avinu, and that was written down. This was a piece of Torah Sheba'al Peh written down in the Mishnaic era as the Sefer Yetzirah. Now, there's a lot to say about the Sefer Yetzirah. I want to share with you a little bit about what it says, and these are some of the most amazing and interesting ideas really ever found in the history of philosophy. I'll give a brief overview of what Sefer Yetzirah says, and then I'll try and contextualize it amongst other thinkers, and then I'll explain why it's very niche in modern day philosophy to take any of these ideas seriously. I'll just share a little bit of personal biography here. I arrived at philosophy through Jewish sources. I didn't study philosophy through secular sources. I learned these sources. And for a time, I thought I was the only person in the world that took Platonism seriously, for example, because when you learn these sources, you come up with fascinating philosophical ideas. Afterwards, I began reading more broadly and discovered there's a whole school of thought out there, very not well known in philosophy, but serious contemporary philosophies in philosophers who take very, very seriously some of these ideas. But I appreciate the ideas that sound very difficult to people the first time they hear them. And some of these ideas I've tried to bring into our discussions smuggle into some of our discussions over the years. So Saadia Gaon, basically in his introduction to Sefer Yetzirah, says that there are a number of views about the origins about what we can say about creation, and he lists 10 perspectives. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I just want to summarize some of them. One perspective, he says, is there's no beginning. Okay, so we've seen that already. It's a tradition that dates back to the time of the Greeks. There is no beginning, and it's a tradition, by the way, that was dominant till the middle of the 1900s. The world has always existed. I think we discussed this when we spoke about Saadia Gaon's introduction to his earlier chapters in Emunah V'Deus. There are a number of problems that we're now aware of in this idea. If you believe the universe is boundless in time and space, and that there are infinite stars, and it was around forever, the sky ought to be ablaze with stars. And I think I mentioned some of these ideas. I don't want to rush through them again. We now, in modernity, we're sort of amazed that for 2,800 years, this was the dominant philosophy. It just went on and on and on and on, because we exist in a world that doesn't seem to us to be eternal. It seems to age, and therefore, if it ages, surely at some point it would all run out and it would all decay. But it was a philosophy around, and it's a philosophy that Jews rejected despite being the mainstream philosophy. The Rambam writes in his Moed Nevuchim, or Saadia Gaon himself writes, that we have no choice but to reject it because the Torah tells us not like that. Were it proven, says the Rambam, then we would have to deal with it. I mentioned already that the belief in an eternal universe doesn't believe believe in God of first cause. Because first doesn't need to mean before in time. It can also mean before conceptually. And the Rambam's analogy is it's a bit like holding down a spring. I can be the cause of the spring being held down, even if the spring and I have existed for all time. So it's not necessarily an atheistic ideology, but it certainly drifts towards a deistic ideology in which God doesn't intervene, maybe. And it can lend itself to atheism. But the Greeks seem to have, Plato and others, seem to have been able to conceive of it as both allowing belief in God and an eternal universe. And this really only began drifting away from Western thought as Einstein demonstrated that we live in. One of the implications of Einstein is that we live in an expanding universe, Hubble and the like. And if we're living in an expanding universe, then it must have contracted back till it emerged from a singularity. And now we currently believe a universe that's 13.8 billion years old, a universe that has a beginning very much like the beginning we've always believed in, a beginning of space and time. If any of this is unclear, please listen to the earlier recordings and you'll come out super clear on all of this. Okay. So, but again, just to emphasize, this is the first theory Saadia Gaon says that exists, that the universe is eternal and always was. Then he brings a theory which again came from the Greeks, that the universe as we know it didn't always exist, but the raw material of the universe always existed. Tiny particles, atoms, right? The Greeks are the ones that coined the term atoms. And this idea that the universe is built up of tiny building blocks, that existed. So it wasn't yet formed into any particular shape, but there's some basic formless matter that existed previously, and that was shaped at some point into time and shape into the universe as we know it. And this is the second theory. And he goes through a number of other theories. The Rambam, by the way, the Rambam Nachmanides al mentions this in Reish also, where he cites the Greek hyuli. Hyuli is often translated as ether. That there's some sort of raw material around which was formless and shapeless, and that was shaped into existence, but the raw material of the universe was some sort of cosmic soup, was always around in existence previously. Rosh Hashanah dismisses these because they're not in accordance with the Torah. He has a third theory that he says, which is that we shouldn't contemplate creation at all. Maybe there's just nothing we can say about it because it's beyond any comprehension, and therefore there is a version of this floating around now amongst scientists, in which they say, since by definition the universe came into existence with a breakdown of laws of nature and science, because all science is rational thinking, and rational thinking is it believes in conservation of mass, conservation of energy, laws of nature. The formulas of science break down once you get to the singularity, when you have infinite density and infinite mass and infinite energy and the like. All science is built up in cause and effect, but by definition something coming into existence is above cause and effect. Never, there's nothing meaningful we humans can say about it at all. If you are a scientist who's skeptical of all philosophy, in other words, if you make the philosophical error of equating science with everything there is that humans have to say about life, then you may adopt this position. There's simply nothing rational we can say about this. Maybe I'll just pause and say something about this. In the 21st century, the system of rational thought that works best and that we believe in most and has demonstrated the most success is science and maths, right? This is the system of rational thought that has been most successful and productive. Many are skeptical of any other theories outside the sort of extreme rationalism. And they say, look, philosophy has been around for thousands of years and speculating here and there and really got nowhere. Even moral thought has really got nowhere. Maybe the most we can say about morality is if, evolutionary biology gives rise to some sort of moral principles or the like. This is sort of an extreme type of materialist or scientism, we can call it. Not just belief in science, which we all believe in, but belief that science is the only rational thought humans can engage in. So some scientists would say, well, creation or any theories about that are fundamentally non-scientific. And there's a truth to that they're non-scientific in the sense that they don't lend themselves to formulae and to equations. They're not non-scientific in the sense that they are anti-science. They're simply claiming that there's that outside science that we humans can at least think about and maybe draw meaning from, and that's where the Torah comes in. So there was already from the time of Gaon a school of thought that said by definition trying to say anything about creation is meaningless and pointless. And you can see where this is coming from. We've already grappled with this as we became aware that all human language has its limitations, right? That in a sense we have to resort to negative theology when we say God is infinite. There's a breakdown in the ability of humans to speak. Nonetheless, the fact that we struggle to speak about these ideas doesn't mean there's nothing rational we can say about this. So Rosh Hashanah suggests these three theories. He runs through another set of theories, and then he arrives at theories 7, 8, and 9. I'm sorry, he gives 9 theories. He arrives at theories 7, 8, and 9. Now, 9 is Torah, basically. God created the world, Yesh Me'ayin, something from nothing, all in one go, which is the classic Torah belief. But he's interested in theories 7 and 8 because he believes they carry a truth to them, and we need to understand what sort of truth they carry. And here we enter one of the most ostensibly balmy ideas ever put forward in philosophy. And I want to share with you the history of the idea. Gaon doesn't quote this in his name. I'll tell you in outline what he says, and then I'll tell you the history of the idea. Theory 7 is that the universe was fashioned through numbers, And theory 8 is that the universe was fashioned through numbers and letters. And theory 9 is that the universe was fashioned through God creating the world. And our Gaon points out that Sefer Yetzirah seems to believe in theory 8, that the universe is created through numbers and letters. And he says, I think there's some truth in theories 7 and 8, that the universe was created through numbers and letters. But we have to understand that God brought everything into existence, including numbers and letters. And then, at least according to the Sefer Yetzirah, through numbers and letters, brought existence into being. Now, he doesn't reference who says these theories. Theory 8, he says, is Sefer Yetzirah. He doesn't reference who says theory 7. I think he means the Pythagoreans. And here we get to the most one of the most quirky ideas ever in the history of philosophy. We've all heard of Pythagoras. I hope we've all heard of Pythagoras, because of Pythagoras' theorem, which probably Pythagoras didn't come up with. The triangle, that the square of the sums of the sides is equivalent to the square of the hypotenuse. A squared plus b squared equals h squared, etc. Pythagoras may or may not have been the originator of the theory. He definitely was a mathematician. He was also the founder of a faith and a religion and a cult that worshipped numbers. And there was a whole mystical school of thought in which they engaged in mystical and religious practices in their worship of numbers. And this was a religion or a faith that lasted for several generations until it died out for reasons that I don't understand. It's such an appealing philosophical system. But Pythagorean faith died out. So he was not just a mathematician, but he had students who were mathematicians who worshipped numbers. So it's an amazing system of thought. I want to share with you why he's in a certain particular way onto something. I want to emphasize famous Greeks are never stupid. There's always something interesting in what they have to say. And I want to explain sort of a little bit more about these ideas, and then hopefully understand what Gaon is saying in Sefer Yetzirah. I apologize, because I did say this year was going to be more history than philosophy, but as I said, I missed out Sefer Yetzirah, and it'll probably be next week that we finish off the history of these ideas. There are concepts that seem in our mind. Everything has a cause, right? Everything is brought into existence. This is one of the bread and butter arguments of philosophy. If you see a sheep, you know that there's a mother sheep who has a mother's mother sheep and a great-great-grand, and so on back in time, which is what leads you either to an infinitely old universe, because you just have sheep all the way back in the past, or to a first cause, a type of cause that breaks out from the system of causality, that somehow is above time and space, is amaterial, is non-material, and therefore isn't trapped in this eternal paradox of an infinite chain or causal chain. And that's kind of where monotheism starts. That's, in a sense, maybe you could say, the debate between monotheists and eternal universe. Now, one of the ways one of the struggles people often have with this is that this seems like a sort of intellectual dodge. Well, your premise is built on the idea that everything has a cause, and the cause itself has a cause, and therefore you're stuck in an infinite chain of causes. And the answer is, well, there's a first cause that is uncaused. Well, very clever. So why can't that first cause be a sheep, right? You know, and there's an infinite chain of sheep. Why can't there just be a first sheep that just came into existence? And the answer is, well, we don't see things like sheep coming into existence, and we don't know what that would mean rationally and conceptually, that it just pops into existence. Whereas a first cause isn't the sort of thing that needs to pop into existence. It just always was, and therefore that answers the problem. Sheep weren't always. We see that sheep come into existence and they age and eventually they die. And even rocks come into existence and eventually decay and are eroded. Whereas first cause is kind of above time and space and therefore doesn't have this philosophical problem. Now, is there any way we can relate to that idea? What do we mean by that? And the answer is that certain type of concepts seem to also, in certain particular peculiar ways, be above time and space and don't really pop into existence in the same way as other things do, and don't seem to pop out of existence either. And in this context, let's take the number 4. Imagine one day if I turned up at the Sunday Shir in a great stress and flurry of excitement, and I say, we have just discovered that the number 4 has disappeared, right? It's ceased to exist, and this is going to be a major crisis in computing industry and in accountancy and the actuarial world and in science and so on. It doesn't seem to be the sort of thing that can appear or disappear. When did the number 4 come into existence? It's a concept. Concepts don't seem to lend themselves to coming into creation or destruction. They just are. Now, The counter argument against this is that concepts are features that emerge from the human mind. They are constructs that we create in order to help us think. They don't really have any objective existence. And possibly Aristotle drifted towards that view, but Plato didn't think so. Plato thought that a concept like the number four had a type of eternal, independent, autonomous existence to it, even were humans not to exist, even were humans not to conceive of things. Let me try and explain what this means. Imagine all humans went extinct. Would the concept of number four cease to exist? Had humans never existed, would there be no concept of the number four? It doesn't seem to be the sort of idea that's dependent upon human existence. It seems to exist autonomously in the world of ideas. And here we now drift towards Plato's world of forms, in which concepts exist independent of their material expression. We'll take this further shortly, but I just want you to understand what I mean. Imagine there was four of nothing in the universe. We live in a universe in which there was only three of anything. There happens to be, we live in a universe where there were only three atoms, only three particles, only three molecules. There wasn't four of anything in the universe. Would the number four cease to exist? Right? We don't know what that would mean. Again, it seems to be a concept that's independent of any material expression whatsoever. So, yes.
Basically, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, or up to 9.
11 from this purpose is as much as a number as 9. It doesn't matter how we choose to configure it in base 10.
Numbers really aren't independent. I think, did they not arise because it was like a grouping? There were 3 sheep or there were 4 sheep.
That may be how humans may have come to think of numbers and become aware of numbers through counting sheep. But the concept of numbers, Plato argues, exists pre-human thought. And there's again, I just want to, as a thought experiment, if humans cease to exist, would there not be a concept of numbers? So Plato argues that concepts have existence independent of whether they find expression in actuality or not. I'm not, by the way, trying to convince anyone of this. If you've thought deeply about these matters, you may have your own view about it. If you haven't, all I would say is that this series of Shurim is simply designed to encourage thought. I'm not expecting that on a Sunday morning at 9:34, in a 60-second summary, I'm going to convince anyone of raging debates. All I want to say is that whether you end up agreeing or disagreeing, Plato and Aristotle were seriously clever people, and these ideas deserve thought. And part of the purpose of the Sunday series is to encourage us to think more deeply about these ideas. I'm putting it out there simply, are numbers simply a figment of human, are they simply a tool that human beings use, or do they have some independent abstract existence? I will say that almost every senior mathematician I've spoken to, and by the way, mathematicians are not philosophers and scientists are not philosophers, but when you read many mathematicians drift towards philosophy, many of them experience numbers as having independent existence. And all I'm trying to say is that there's a lot going for this argument. It's not an argument to dismiss. It's something that deserves thought and consideration. Yes. Okay, so without shocking them, 0 may not be a number. If a number is yes, it may be a non-concept. It may be negative theology. We get back to negative theology over here. Okay, I'm not trying here to again in 3 minutes summarize the whole of Platonic thought. It's fascinating. This is really what through the Rambam I discovered Plato and began thinking of myself as a Platonist because it made sense to me. And then I thought, well, this is crazy. Like, no one's had any of these ideas for thousands of years. Like, am I getting myself up some conspiracy theory blind alley of thought? So I began reading more widely. And there's a whole school of thought, the Neoplatonists and onwards. There's serious academics and philosophers and so on to this day that takes very seriously this sort of line of thought. Again, it doesn't matter what my own particular view is aligned with them, but it doesn't matter. I'm not a philosopher. Go and read that which is written about this and form your own opinion. I hope you come out on the correct side. Yes. Yeah. No. This is not. These are not in any ways. There's nothing kafira in this. So we'll come to our Saadia in a few moments. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're slowly. We have a long road to travel still. Yes.
We used our alphabet for that.
Yes, yeah. Well, again, these are all semantics. Whether we use base 10 and we count numbers up to 10, or whether we use base 8 or base 2 or base 11, that doesn't matter. And which symbols we use, whether we use Indian symbols, which are very convenient, or we use Roman numerals or gematria, which are very inconvenient, again, it doesn't matter in the purpose of this. I'm talking about the concept of a number, the idea of a number. Let me give you another example of this. A perfect circle. Can we conceive of a perfect circle? We can. Can we use it? Yes, we do use it the whole time in maths. Is it a concept that seems to exist? Yes. Can it exist independently of any material or physical expression? Yes, we can. And the reason we know that we can is because, as far as we are concerned, we don't think there is a perfect circle in the universe. As far as we understand, if you drill deeply enough, you will only ever get to quite a chunky circle. Like, imagine approximations getting ever closer to a circle. So picture an 8-sided object, which looks a bit like a circle if you look at it from far away. And then you make it a 16-sided circle, or a 384-sided circle. So you have it getting ever more like a circle. So as far as we understand, the most perfect circle in the universe, and it comes the closest to being a perfect circle, is simply a 10 trillion-sided circle. But not more than that. Why? Because atoms are chunky. And if you throw in quantum mechanics, they're not just chunky, they're moving around all over the place. So as far as we understand, there are no perfect circles in the universe. There's something on that, as far as we understand, there is no perfect point in the universe, yet maths uses points. There's no perfectly straight lines in the universe, yet maths uses perfectly straight lines. And we have no problem not just thinking that these things are tools of human ingenuity in humans' minds, but thinking that the concepts would exist even were all humans to go extinct. Now, can we take this further still? And Plato did take this further still. Plato considered the concept of a table. And I've used the concept of a table before here in this year many times. And he points out that we humans have a concept of a table. And the concept of a table is above any material manifestation of the table. If I showed you a glass lounge table, I showed you a very large board table with 15 legs, I showed you a plastic table, a wooden table. When I say to you, this is a table, this physical object is a table, where is a table that I'm saying it is? Where is that table? The answer is as a concept. What is that table made of? The answer is not made of anything. How many legs does it have? What's its dimensions? It's just a concept. We humans are profoundly conceptual. We deal with concepts very easily the whole time. So we have a concept of table, which has certain rules to it, but doesn't need to be made of any particular material. We have nested concepts, by the way. A table is part of a larger concept. It is within the set of furniture, for example. Furniture itself is within the set of material things, and so on and so forth. So we have concepts that also seem to supersede any physical manifestation. If I became the world dictator, still on my to-do list, and then I passed a law that all tables have to be destroyed, and I succeeded in destroying all tables in existence, would the concept table cease to exist? Yeah, presumably not, right? So it's very interesting, a world of concepts. By the way, we humans become conceptual very quickly. You can have a 1.5-year-old, a 2-year-old, a 2.5-year-old, and the 2-year-old says, "What is this?" And you say, "It's a table." And they understand what that sentence means. It's a profoundly deep and philosophical event that has just occurred. Because already at that age, the child in some ways is living more in the world of ideas than the world of physical existence. There's a physically grabbable object in front of them, and they don't yet feel they have it. They know what it is. And I tell them it's a table, which is an abstract concept, and they very easily live with that, understand that this is a table and that's a table, even though they're made of different material, of different shape, of different size, of different number of legs, of different feel and touch and smell, and yet they very easily conceptualize this. So we live in a world of very conceptual, of the world of ideas, or as Plato would put it, I'll come to you in a moment, Jonathan, the world of forms. Plato thought of concepts as forms, as the abstract sort of form, and the matter in which it kind of settles itself or shapes is the raw material, but the form of table exists independent of any actual tables or the like. So, Jonathan.
The question of the 2-year-old. Are they actually grappling concept table, or are they asking for a label for the object? You could imagine that there are 2 tables.
Yes.
One, which is conventional inverted commas.
Yes.
One which is a modern art.
Yes, and the child struggles to understand what it is. Yes, that is what's going on. But very swiftly, again, I don't know if it takes place at 2 or 3, it moves beyond labels, which is how Aristotle thought about things as just human categories, to becoming concepts. And that seem to exist somewhat independently. I'm going to unpick these ideas shortly, but bear with me, and just in a sense, this is at some point, certainly as adults, we're all aware that we're conceptual and we understand this concept. And at some quite young age, the child makes that transition into quite remarkably into the concept. Again, exactly what age and so on, but it ceases to be a label and becomes a concept. We can now speculate: did the concept of table exist before anyone made any tables? Also an interesting idea to think about. Is it the sort of concept that can appear and disappear with time? If all humans went extinct, would the concept of table disappear? Where would it disappear to? What does it mean for concepts to disappear? When an artist or an inventor discovers a new idea or invents something new, are they creating something, or are they merely uncovering something that's there inherent in reality? And again, you can speak to creative people, and they do experience themselves as discovering or uncovering, rather than, in a sense, creating something. I appreciate we're getting there into very abstract, but these are ideas that Plato is seriously contemplating and thinking about. Now, Plato then pointed out the following: that we humans live in some way in the world of forms. We think and reason in the world of forms. We wander in the world of forms. We live amongst the angels, if you like. We live in a world that is intellect and ideas and concepts. In some ways, we live more profoundly in that world than in any physical world. And yet, we can only ever meet concepts via their pale physical reflection. So I very profoundly live in a world of concept table, and yet I can only ever meet a physical table. What I mean, I live very profoundly in the world of concept table, because I reason with the concept table very easily, in a way more easily than I reason with a physical table. I can with great difficulty lift up the table and move it around. But I have a concept table, which I very easily live with, that isn't made of any material or any number of legs or any number of shape or anything like that. I live amongst the world of ideas. And here you get to Plato's very famous parable, the parable of the cave, in which he describes a captive, a child, raised, tied up, chained in a cave, looking towards the end wall of the cave, and their back is towards the entrance of the cave. So they can never see outside into the real world. And all they can ever see are the shadows of things going on outside on the wall of the cave. Picture it as a bit of a projector onto a screen. So the child is facing inwards into the cave, looking at a screen, and all they can ever see is the shadows walking outside. Or he speaks about if there's a fire lit outside and it's nighttime, and just sees the shadows moving across the wall of the cave. And they can never see the real things, but they can conceive of the reality beyond. And he says this is the kind of frustration of human existence, that we live amongst concepts, but we can never directly experience them. We experience them in our inner minds, in our concepts, yet we can never quite meet them. This tie sort of begins edging towards, and this is certainly how the Rambam thought about these things, the idea that our consciousness and our mind is somehow godly and angelic in essence. It deals with immaterial concepts and ideas which are above time and space and are conceptual, are forms. And yet we ourselves, our physical bodies, never meet these. I think I've presented this before in the frustration around communication about ideas. We have no vocabulary to speak about ideas other than using physical imagery. If I want to say I understand, I grasp a concept, right? Let me take you on a journey. Let's use an idea. These are all mechanical borrowings of conceptual thought of this realm of ideas. Have I lost it? Are you with me in some level here? Is this okay? So Plato takes us on this journey towards seeing, in a sense, the world of ideas as existing pre the actual pre in concept, in thought, the physical manifestation of what they are. If you like, if I'm God and I'm gradually creating a universe, let's say it takes place bit by bit, and I've created one object and two objects and three objects, the concept for exists before there's actually a material expression of 4. The concept table exists before I've made the table. The first carpenter or mechanic to make a table, create the concept table pre-exists before the manifestation of table. The concept cat exists before I bring the cat into existence, and so on and so forth. And these are again metaphors that are used by Chazal. There are within Chazal indications of this awareness. They'll sometimes describe the Torah as the blueprints of creation. We say in Chododi, we say Sof Maaseh, that which is done in deed last, but Machshava Techila, in thought is first. So thought always precedes action, but in Plato, it's not just a psychological idea that you first have to think of something before you do something. He's taking it further that the concept exists before the actualization, the concretization, the material manifestation of the concept exists. And in some ways, there's something less about the material physical manifestation than the concept. What does it mean there's something less? Material objects can decay. Material objects are only found in one space. This table is very wonderful. It's very useful. I couldn't balance my laptop on a concept table. So it has an advantage, no doubt, but also has a disadvantage. This table only exists here, but doesn't exist over there. It only exists for a period of time, and eventually it will wear out, and it will be brutally discarded by Danny with no empathy and care towards the table. It will cease to exist, and we will throw it away. And it's only a very limited table because it's made of plastic. It's only got 4 legs. In many ways, it's much less of a table than the concept table, because the concept table is everywhere and for all time, and it's eternal, and it's made of all materials, or it's above material, it's above space and time and so on. So it's a remarkable idea. Let me just try and give one more example of this idea. The concept cat. So cats have biology, and we can study the biology, and we can define cats as a concept. Imagine all cats go extinct. Does there cease to be wisdom in catness? Well, we can study the biology of the dodo, even though there's no dodos anymore, right? And it can be a field of biology. So when do concepts come into existence and when do they disappear? Again, I'm stretching Plato to I'm going to stretch him one stage more, just to explain why these ideas need a lot of careful thought about how far we can take them. Sorry, Andrew, you were going to say something.
I think we spoke about who's become extinct, spoke about table, which seems to be there around this time in the model.
Perhaps not.
Was there a concept of motor car?
Very interesting. Well, if there was a concept of table, maybe there's a concept of motor car, yeah? And maybe the discovery of these... Again, one has to be careful which concepts are simple concepts and which concepts are combination concepts. So it could be a motor car as a concept, but in principle, yes. Let's take one more idea, one more stretching of this, and then we'll stop and we'll try and just sort of draw this back a little bit before I run out of time. Julius Caesar was a human being. He has become a concept. We can learn him, we can study him, even though he has ceased to exist for a couple of thousand years now. Can humans become concepts? What does that mean for a human to become a concept? Does that make them in some way immortal? These are very, very interesting ideas, and they do begin edging towards spiritual ideas also. If remember last week when we were speaking about a human who makes themselves into a cow, all they're interested in is grazing grass. And when they die, they cease to exist because there's nothing left. What is there of the human being to be there if they have no body and there is nothing of themselves? Whereas a human who has made themselves into something more spiritual, but spiritual is one of these messy words. What exactly do we mean by this? Maybe has some eternity to their existence. So maybe if you're philosophically inclined, you begin borrowing concepts back and forth and say another way of thinking about it is a human who makes themselves into a platonic form, into a concept that has an existence to them, something like a number, some level of existence that we spoke about it last week more psychologically as just a consciousness that can survive. If my whole consciousness is just dedicated to grass, using grass as a metaphor for all forms of physical existence, and there's nothing in me that's anything beyond that, then when my body ceases, what is there of me to continue? If I've dedicated my life to spiritual pursuits, to morality, to givingness, to care, where would that disappear to? We kind of were using these ideas previously. I said, I spoke about helping the little old lady cross the road with her shopping bag. That act of kindness, where the universe can continue to exist for another 14 billion years, the universe can disappear. Where would the act of kindness disappear to? Is it the sort of idea that's bound in time and space? Or is the kindness, the moral, that kindness itself, is it something which in some sense is above time and space? So the philosophically inclined Rishonim, the Rambam and the Gaon, who are intensely aware of Plato's thoughts, do kind of borrow the language of Platonic thought to try and make these ideas a little bit more graspable. One of the reasons I speak about all of these things is because a lot of the time we use terminology in Yiddishkeit that doesn't mean that much to us. And it's often helpful to allow some slippage of ideas to at least give us some ability to relate to these ideas. Is the Jewish concept of an neshama identical to consciousness? Maybe yes, maybe not. But is the idea of consciousness as being something above our physical bodies, and therefore something that can survive the demise of the body, a useful way of beginning to grasp what we mean by the inner me and the inner sense of self and my awareness? I think it's a useful concept. Is Olam Haba identical to the human who's made themselves into a cow and therefore has nothing of themselves to exist, and the human that has made themselves into an active consciousness, therefore that continues to exist? Maybe yes, maybe not. As you edge towards the more philosophically inclined Rishonim, the concepts begin overlapping ever increasingly. The Rambam speaks about angels, for example, as secholim nedolim, as intelligences that aren't bound in any body form, as opposed to human beings who are secholim, who are intelligences that are embodied. So it's useful. Kedusha, holiness, it's one of these times you saw that, be holy. What does holy mean? Well, a way of thinking about that is transcendent, beyond transcending your ego, transcending your sense of self, transcending physical presence. So it's sometimes useful to know these philosophical terms, even if you're not going to go as far as maybe the rationalist Rishonim in these areas. It gives us ways of beginning to understand these things. One of the ways of if you want to sort of reflect on the wonder of what a human being is, and I don't think we do this often enough, we kind of, I just am what I am. But to understand that we humans walk profoundly in the world of forms, we walk amongst the angels, and yet we have bodies which walk amongst the animals, draws us very close to this sort of Jewish idea again of we are somehow a combination of the spiritual and the physical, but perhaps it gives us ways of thinking about it in a more sophisticated form, in a more careful form. Just the wonder of what it is to be a human being who so profoundly lives in this world of Platonic forms, of ideas, and yet is so physically present. Now, why am I bringing all of this up? It is clear that there is a hierarchy of ideas, of Platonic forms. And I try to sort of share them. I went actually in deliberate order when I was sharing this idea. And I maybe, as you all take these ideas away and contemplate them, I may have succeeded in convincing you, Plato may have succeeded in convincing you, that, for example, numbers have existence beyond any physical manifestation. That's one end of the spectrum. The opposite end of the spectrum, the idea that the concept of Julius Caesar always existed and always will exist for all time, you may be more skeptical about. So we've got two extremes on how far we want to take Platonic ideas. So numbers actually, as one begins thinking about it, sounds pretty convincing. Even if I live in a universe in which there's not 4 of anything, there is something a bit faintly ridiculous about the idea that the number 4 ceases to exist as a concept. Even if there were never intelligent, reasoning human beings, I know the instinct that no humans came up with the concept of numbers as we had to start counting sheep. There is such a viewpoint, but I think if we probe and think deeply about these ideas, many of ourselves will find ourselves somewhat drifting towards Plato's ideas that the concept of number always existed somehow eternally before intelligence arose, and even if the intelligence will never have arisen, the concept would apply. So we've got a hierarchy of ideas. Let me just take you through the hierarchy. I think numbers are pretty convincing. They're quite convincing. I think geometric shapes are also quite convincing, except only in a universe that has spatiality. Right? A triangle and a circle can only exist if we live in a spatial universe. Numbers would seem to exist even in an aspatial universe. Even before any spatiality exists, we can think of the concept of numbers. Cats, don't know, something to think about. That maybe there's something inherent in sort of biology and how it plays out. I don't know. Tables and motor cars perhaps begin getting even less convincing until you end up with Julius Caesar, where you really have to be quite an extreme Platonist to sort of go in that direction. Now, I'm not taking sides in these things. I simply want you to understand, honoured audience, ladies, online gentlemen, where we're coming from in this in this idea. So, if we drift towards this way of thinking, there does seem to be something immortal and eternal around some of these ideas. And this is where the Pythagoreans are coming from, this is where the Platonists are coming from. The idea that the universe may be preceded by concepts, and that the concepts may, in a sense, be, and here we'll have to unpick this, the cause of physical existence. Now, there is a flaw in this, even in this. Even numbers don't really seem to cross the threshold entirely. I mentioned to you that triangles only make sense as a concept in a spatial universe. In a universe which is beyond time and space, a universe which is complete unity, that's completely simple, which is what we mean by God, a universe that's infinite in the sense of non-finite, a universe that we spoke about at the beginning of the shir, in which there is no logic even, no terminology that can be used, can we even talk about numbers? Maybe even numbers is a product as a concept of a breakdown of unity, of the entry of plurality into existence. So all I want to say is that even, is anyone with me here? Have I lost? Even with concepts, there's a hierarchy of concepts, and the idea that all concepts exist or have eternally existed, and what their generative or causative power is not a simple one. I want to shift just to a more modern example of this. There are current philosophers who think that philosophical or moral concepts also have some form of Platonic existence. Love, for example, maybe a sort of Platonic form. And whilst it's difficult to conceive of, even if we can conceive of numbers as having an existence, the idea that numbers can generate real, material, physical existence is more difficult. There are serious philosophers, though, that think that the universe should be viewed as data, as mathematical formulae, and that somehow out of mathematical formulae, information can emerge existence. To the best of our plumbing of the universe that we live in, actually, it does seem that the most basic working mechanism of the universe is abstract maths. Very, very interesting. Many current philosophers are edging towards a viewpoint that we should think of the universe as a data calculating machine, as an information processor. So again, I'm not trying to convince anyone of this. I simply want you to hear why serious people could think of concepts as being the gods, can think of numbers as being the ultimate cause of existence, or Platonic forms. Now, I'm running out of time, so I simply conclude with the following. Gaon says there are theories out there that the deepest, most absolute existence we can connect to, and thus the gods, if we mean by God absolute existence, an uncaused causa, which is what we mean by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then numbers are a candidate for the gods, for the absolute existence. Numbers seem to share in some way of absolute existence in a way more than us physical humans or temporal humans or tables do. So somewhere around that territory is where the Pythagoreans are wandering. Somewhere around the territory of not just numbers, but ideas. And when Gaon says letters, his eighth theory is numbers and letters. He means the building blocks of concepts, not a particular letter, the letter A or the letter B or the like, but the building blocks of concepts have absolute existence. He's drifting towards Platonic ideas. An idea that either numbers or broader spread of ideas are the closest we humans can get to absolute existence, are philosophical ideas that bear contemplation. Gaon, in theory number 9 of creation, says, I think Sefer Sura adopts versions of 7 and 8 in thinking that God mediated existence, brought into existence, created existence, and used the channel of Platonic forms or mathematical ideas to create the universe. However, there is a God that brought those all into existence. Don't think that these are the gods. They're not the gods. They are brought into existence by God. But yes, I'm okay with the idea that when we probe the universe, the vehicle through which God manifests existence is through these ideas. The idea that the universe at heart is profoundly mathematical, is that the information is the deepest we can get to in objective existence, or Platonic forms is the deepest we can get to in existence, that idea I'm happy to subscribe to. So if by concept 7 or 8, Pythagorean or Platonic forms, you think this is the generative cause of existence, I don't accept that. So geometric shapes, cannot be the gods. They're also dependent on the spatial universe. Even numbers can't be the gods because they're still in a universe of logic. Once logic and reason and data and information has been brought into existence, the idea of eternal numbers rings true, but it has to be within existence. So God is above that. God brought these into existence, but the idea that the channel or energy through which existence flows and works is forms, is concepts, is numbers, that I'm open to, and that Seder of Gaon is, I think, what Sefer Yetzirah is about. Open Sefer Yetzirah, you can find it nowadays online. Sefer Yetzirah, it talks about numbers and letters as the shape, the creative force of the universe. Many understood this as mystically, that you can somehow create a golem out of this. These are mystical ideas. Saadia Gaon understood these as philosophical, and understood these as the ideas of concepts and numbers being the deepest we can get within the realm of reason to understand that which is most absolute in existence. But he says Sefer Yetzirah is part of the Jewish system, and behind that, of course, lies God. It's God who brings all these ideas into existence, and that's the message of Sefer Yetzirah. And in reproducing, he's arguing, I suppose, if Sefer Yetzirah dates back to Avram Avinu, that we have retraced in some shape or form Avram Avinu's journey, in which Avram looks, and there's midrashim that indicate this. He looks at the transience of the world, and he says, it can't be the sun that created the world because the sun is overshadowed by the clouds and the sun gives way to the moon and etc. And therefore the only cause of existence is something above and beyond. He adds into a stage of that, there is an above and beyond, which is numbers, but then Avram and geometry, and Avram even goes through that. Even that can't be the ultimate cause of existence. There is something which is genuine beyond even the realm of concepts. So even the realm of concepts, which are so important to creation, according to Platonic and Pythagorean thought, even that is in its sense, is also a creation. So we have multiple tiers of creation. We have a God who creates the realm of concepts, the realm of reason. As soon as Bereshis bara, even before there's any physical existence in creation, that you need the realm of ideas. We're living in a rational universe, a universe that has numbers. Then the manifestation of that is the next stage. He then suggests that there's machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel about what was created first, Shemaim and Oretz. He suggests that Shemaim refers to the realm of Platonic form, and Oretz refers to physical existence. Rabbosai, we've run out of time, and I see someone from my Gemara here edging outside to find out where I am, but I couldn't cut off at this point. So I hope you've heard something of Rav Saadia Gaon's amazing thoughts. And I'll just encourage everyone to look into this a bit more, because I think this is so important to understand the world we live in. Okay. It possibly is, yes. Yeah. This is not, God forbid, suggesting that these have independent existence of God. They are all created by God. He's coming to counter the idea that this is some form of demiurge or something like that. And that's what he's saying. These are not independent sources of existence. These are channels through which God creates and operates the world. No, God forbid, no.